We are excited to talk to you today in honor of Autism Acceptance Month about neurodiversity. Our focus will be on understanding, embracing, and accommodating difference. My name is Kelly Beck, and I'll be presenting with my colleague, Dr. Jessie Northrup. We are both assistant professors of psychiatry in the School of Medicine, and we do a lot of work with autistic people across the lifespan. Just to give you a little bit more information about who we are. So we are a part of a very large team here at the University of Pittsburgh. And we have what's called an Autism Center of Excellence, and our program is called the REAACT program. Our research program aims to conduct research that will ultimately improve mental health and well-being for autistic and neurodivergent people across the lifespan. And the things that we're going to talk about today are really a combination of work across a very large team and very large community of autistic partners. And so we're just happy to be here today to represent all of the work that's going on here at Pitt. And to that, wanted to specifically acknowledge there's been several state and federal programs that have funded the work we'll talk about today. We have a lot of involvement and partnerships with autistic community members, whether it's through our PARC group, which is the top right corner you see there, our Pittsburgh Adult Autism Research Community Collaborative. We've worked with the Autistic Student Union at Pitt. We have a school collaborative, our Sun Collaborative, and specifically our colleagues, Dr. Amy Iannotti and Elizabeth Rudenberg, have contributed directly to the slides that you'll see today. And so we're hoping that we'll talk to you a little bit about neurodiversity. What are some common challenges experienced by neurodivergent people within a healthcare setting? And we'll talk a little bit about the disproportionate barriers that neurodivergent people experience in healthcare settings. And then we'll shift to talking about some practical suggestions and tips to try to accommodate and embrace those differences. And just before I get into the slides here, I want to make a mention on language. So many of you here might have been trained just like we were in person first language. Person with disability or a person with autism. And we'll be using identity first language today, so autistic person. And really that's been recommended and advocated for by the autism community. So. Okay, so what is neurodiversity? I know many of you have been to many talks already this month, and so this term is probably very familiar to all of you. And it's, I think showing up in online spaces as well. But just so that we have a shared definition today, when we think about neurodiversity as a concept, we're really thinking about the fact that humans really have diverse experiences. And there's diversity in the way that we experience the world, the way that we think and we feel and we sense things. And so we really are thinking about diversity of minds when we're thinking about neurodiversity broadly. And so then we focus in on neurodivergence. You'll hear us say today the word neurodivergent. And what we mean by that is individuals that may have changes or differences in their neurological structure as compared to the majority of people. And I'm not going to be really exhaustive in the list here, but you might think of this as some individuals that have neurodevelopmental conditions such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, certain learning disabilities, maybe acquired neurodivergence, so a traumatic brain injury, and that's on an exhaustive list here. So we have sort of a heterogeneous grouping. There's a lot of different conditions that may constitute neurodivergence. And so there are different strengths and challenges within each condition, but also there's some overlapping challenges. And then you'll also hear us say the word neurotypical. And what we mean by that is a person whose neurotype is, pretty typically developing with the majority of society. So their developmental trajectory and their cognitive functioning might be pretty similar with what you would expect others. It's sort of a moving target about how prevalent neurodivergence is in the community, but some recent papers have suggested that up to 15 to 20% of people would identify as neurodivergent. So that's a large group of people. And why we're here talking about it today, and I think we're celebrating Autism Acceptance Month, but we're also trying to increase awareness about disproportionate challenges and barriers that neurodivergent and autistic people face, so that maybe we can produce some change. And so we know it's pretty well established over the years that neurodivergent people are having disproportionate challenges and outcomes compared to neurotypical people. So that might look like in schools or in adulthood, difficulty with relationships or acceptance by peers. We see substantially higher rates of trauma and adverse experiences among neurodivergent people. We see pretty alarming rates of unemployment. Some stats are up to like 75% in certain populations, and underemployment, less access to quality health care and mental health care. And a lot of the work that we do in our lab here at Pitt is we focus on alarmingly high rates of mental health diagnoses and suicidality among neurodivergent people. And so there's a snapshot of a paper here that I think is a really good one if you take a screenshot or look it up, suggesting that the lack of supports and expertise for helping adults with autism is a blind spot in mental health care. And then to zoom in on autism specifically for a minute, want to highlight that suicide is one of the leading causes of premature death of autistic people with above average IQ. And it's estimated that about 3/4 of autistic people will have suicidal ideation at some point in their lifetime. And some more recent advances on contributors to explain some of these mental health outcomes. We know now that people who are neurodivergent spend an excess amount of energy trying to fit in to neurotypical social norms, and that comes at a very high cost. We know that other things that contribute to these outcomes are difficulty managing emotions, difficulty managing sensory needs, whether it's not knowing how to manage them, but also being in environments that don't let you manage them. And I already mentioned there's this disproportionate access to adequate health care. So we all agree this is a problem. We have disproportionate outcomes and challenges that neurodivergent people are facing. And so before we move in with my colleague here on tips to improve these things, we thought we would talk a minute about how are we conceptualizing and thinking about disability. So traditionally, when we think about disability within a medical system, it's often characterized as a medical model of disability, which is we're thinking about things more diagnostically, categorizing what deficits there may be or what the challenges may be in order to diagnose or treat someone. And we're really focusing on remediating like a deficit in the individual. An autism example for younger children, a common thing would be like trying to fix eye contact. And so some critiques on the medical model would be, is that really something that needs to be fixed, or is it also that the environment needs to be more accommodating? So the shortcomings is that we're only focusing on the individual. We're not thinking also about what external environmental factors are disabling to someone. And then in contrast, the social model of disability is thinking about that it's the environment that causes a disability. So I think one of the easiest examples to think about this is if you think about a wheelchair user, someone who uses a wheelchair for movement. Pittsburgh is highly disabling, especially for those of you that are sitting there in Oakland, right? Think about what places in Oakland you can get into without stairs, and what areas of the sidewalks are flat without large cracks and have curb cuts. And so, so the social model of disability would suggest that environmental piece is making being having wheelchair users being disabled. And so we want to think about how to remove these system level or societal barriers. And the one that we'll really focus on today is we think about things as there's the biopsychosocial model of disability, which is really a combination of those two I just talked about, which is that disability is really an interconnection between differences biologically, maybe predispositions for psychological challenges, and then also the social environment is going to influence and exacerbate or cause disability. And so when we think about neurodiversity from that biopsychosocial model, there are neurodivergent brains have traits. They really differ per individual, but across neurodivergent people, there are some common challenges or traits that increase cognitive load or the amount of effort you would need to process your information. So that could be due to differences in brain connectivity or filtering or processing information, differences in sensory processing, which is common. We have heightened risk for emotion dysregulation, which we could probably talk for a whole nother talk on that, Jessie and I. But a lot of different things. Some of it is biological, some of it is environmental. And of course, the big thing that we're focusing on here today is that the social environment is not designed for neurodivergent people. And so that's going to cause a lot of extra challenges and barriers and stressors. So our really brilliant colleague, Umi Ayanati, made this video. She said it better than me. I'm going to play it for everyone. And I mean, Jessie, can you just make sure, can you tell me if the sound doesn't work whenever I press play?
No sound.
I think I'll just do it without sound. I pause for you.
Yeah, pause. Oh, there we go.
Okay, so there was nothing audio that you missed except for some fun music. So you can check it out on our YouTube page. But I think that captures what we wanted to talk about today, and that biopsychosocial model of disability that is relevant to neurodivergent people. And so if we zoom into healthcare specifically, because that's why we're all here today, and we think about this, we recently conducted a study here at Pitt where we were just interested in learning about mental health and emotional experiences among autistic people. And we asked this question, can you tell me a story about a recent time you were out of control of your strong emotions? And a surprise to us was that nearly every participant in the study shared a story of trouble managing emotions on the way to or at a healthcare setting. And in subsequent studies, lots of discussion of healthcare trauma and very problematic experiences within a healthcare setting among autistic people. And to give you some context, it's not just our group that has really studied this, it's been replicated worldwide. Healthcare interactions are inherently disruptive and stressful for all people. And then when we think about that extra cognitive load from that video we just watched, it's disproportionately difficult for neurodivergent people. Feeling like they have no control, feeling unheard and not safe and supported. And there's, we put a lot of papers on here for you so that you can read over them yourselves too at another point. But when we synthesize this, some of our, brilliant colleagues wrote a paper on this, the top 5 main barriers within a healthcare system for autistic adults were fear and anxiety, not being able to process information fast enough, which is really highly problematic because then they're not able to make a decision about their health with their provider. Concern about costs, facilities causing sensory issues, and really trouble communicating with providers in general. So there's lots of area for improvement here, and I think the positive thing about this is that many of these barriers are addressable with some consideration in designing universally. So I'm going to shift over to my colleague here and let her talk about some solutions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kelly. Yeah, so I'm going to kind of shift into talking about some practical tips for improving autistic patient experiences. This is going to be a little bit more specifically focused on autistic patients or clients, although I would say almost all of this is going to apply to neurodivergent folks in general, and really almost all of it would probably improve things for all of us. So that's just worth, I think, acknowledging. So kind of starting with how to improve the larger systems and environments. One thing you really want to think about is keeping things predictable when possible. So last minute changes and unexpected events can be very disruptive for neurodivergent individuals. And so doing things like making social stories for common things that happen in your clinic or your hospital, wherever you work, visual depictions of what can be expected, or what kinds of circumstances a person might encounter in that setting. As much as possible, trying to keep the person that person is contacting or interacting with consistent can make a really big difference. And especially in cases where that's not possible, then allowing for a trusted or consistent person to join them in interactions when that's possible can be really helpful. And next slide. Kelly talked about this previously, but sensory challenges can be a really big deal for folks on the spectrum. And so thinking about how to make whatever environment that you work in more sensory friendly. What that typically means on a broad scale is decreasing distractions and increasing supports. And so we just have some examples across kind of different areas here. From a visual perspective, having softer lighting, reducing visual distractions on the walls, like reducing the number of brightly colored posters and things that are all over the place. Thinking about auditory sensory things. What is the sound of the fan? How much can you hear things from room to room? Are there ways of having a little bit more sound control or adding in white noise that can be helpful? Reducing general clutter in your space. It can be really helpful to have chairs, and if you're in a room with a client, have chairs that actually face where attention is meant to be. That can help to reduce distractions and make kind of the meaning of the interaction clearer. And then where it's not possible to make the entire environment sensory friendly, and even when it is, it can be really, really important to have at least one room or multiple rooms that can be safe, sensory friendly places that a person can go in a crisis or really when they need a different space. So Kelly, at the next slide, here you can see an example of some tools that you could use to make a safe space in your clinic or in your hospital setting to create basically a sensory friendly room. So that might include things like a comfortable place to sit with pillows and a mat, low lighting, so covering up sort of fluorescent lights and maybe having a night light instead, installing sound panels on the wall to reduce sound from other places, and potentially having a white noise machine, having blankets, weighted blankets can be a really helpful thing, and then sensory toys, so things like stim toys or fidget toys and plush toys can be really helpful for people who are trying to regulate their sensory experiences. Next slide. I want to plug that the UPMC Disability Resource Center has a sensory toolkit that you can order through ePro for your clinic that includes a lot of these really helpful things, including sensory noise canceling headphones, sunglasses, weighted blankets, a number of different types of fidget toys. I only found out about this recently, so I'm trying to let other people know about it. And these also are just really nice examples of things to include. So even if you don't, order these things through UPMC, these are some good examples of what might be nice to have. Next slide. So now I'm going to move on to some tips for interacting with autistic patients. So more of that kind of like one-on-one interaction. And to start, I want to talk about making assumptions. So we hear a lot from autistic people that they have this experience of people making assumptions about their competence or ability based on the way they communicate. So I wanted to read a few of these quotes from autistic individuals. These come from the Academic Autism Spectrum Partnership in Research and Education. There's tons of information on their website about autism and healthcare, so I highly recommend you check them out. This won't be the last time I'm talking about their work. So I'm going to read a couple of these quotes. First one is, usually when I demonstrate a large vocabulary or some fundamentals, my needs, especially around communication, are then ignored. My choice is then to pretend to be less intelligent and accept their infantilism, or to be confused, frustrated, and stressed out. The second quote is, I have used my Alpha Smart portable communication device when my speech feels too slow or difficult to understand for medical appointments. Some of the doctors have been really great, but others have acted really condescending when I use it, also immediately assuming I couldn't be alone, had to have had parents there too. So I try to go without it even when my speech is in a poorer shape. And finally, this last one, just because I have difficulty expressing what is going on with me doesn't mean I am stupid or that I am making things up. And so I think you can see the way that these assumptions work on both ends, in which people find that if they have fluent speech or they seem to be what some people might call higher functioning, then people assume they don't need supports or their needs are ignored. And then on the flip side, if somebody's having difficulty communicating or using different means of communication, that there are these assumptions that they aren't competent or they need a lot more support or they can be spoken to condescendingly. Next slide. So when we think about not making assumptions and kind of what that means, really importantly, always talk directly to the person, even if they have a support person with them, even if they don't seem to be looking at you, they're moving their body, maybe they're not showing you those sort of neurotypical signs that they're listening or can understand, still talk directly to a person. And this is really related to presuming competence. You want to always presume competence. It's going to be always better to make the mistake of presuming too much competence than it is going to be to err on the side of presuming someone can't understand or that you can't talk to them and be wrong about that. So presume competence regardless of someone's communication style or ability. Next slide. You might really be used to assessing whether someone is engaged and understanding you by the way that they make eye contact, things like nodding and smiling, sitting still and paying attention, or responding immediately. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that autistic and other neurodivergent individuals might be able to pay attention better when they're not making eye contact. A lot of autistic people say, I can either make eye contact with you or I can listen to you. And so it's probably going to be better for them to listen, or able to pay attention better when they're not generally worrying about giving these neurotypical signals like nodding and smiling, of paying attention. They may move their hands or bodies while they're listening, and they may need much more time to process before responding. And so one thing to really be aware of here is that some of the ways that autistic people might interact or the things that they need might feel awkward or different to you as a neurotypical person. And on the same note, your way of interacting with them might feel difficult and challenging to them. A lot of people call this the double empathy problem. And so thinking of ways that we as neurotypical people can adjust to a different way of communicating and interacting, and understanding that just because somebody isn't showing these neurotypical signs doesn't mean that they're not paying attention or understanding. Next slide. It's always going to be the most helpful thing to find out about an individual person's communication preferences. I'm going to talk a little bit more later about how some tools you might be able to use to do that. But here are some things that you can consider sort of that are more universal. Always helpful to use precise and concrete language when talking. I talked about this a little before, but to the degree that you can use visuals and lists, so creating visual social stories, using visuals for situations in which a person needs to make a decision, or lists can be helpful too. Making sure to integrate pauses for processing information. Sometimes neurotypical people feel like long pauses are awkward. Try to kind of like release that from your system. Leaving pauses can be extremely helpful for people. Waiting for people to respond, not demanding eye contact, and then finding ways to reduce the amount of verbal discussion and explaining. So this can look like encouraging people to prepare notes in advance or prepare their questions in advance. They could even send them to you if there was a way for them to send them to you in advance. Writing for you to write down important information or relay it visually, especially if there's instructions that someone needs to follow, so that they can be reviewed by the patient and potentially support people later. And then potentially finding ways to allow people to ask questions later to follow up. So not everything needs to be happening in this quick way. Another really important and helpful tool can be the making communication cards available in your space. So communication cards can be like these simple cards that allow people to communicate, especially in situations where they get overwhelmed. Many neurodivergent and autistic people say that their communication changes depending on how much cognitive load they're experiencing, right? So somebody who, when they're feeling calm and they're in a not cognitively overloaded, are able to communicate fluently. When they're in a position where they are feeling overloaded, they might not have access to that same degree of communication. And so communication cards can be really helpful in those circumstances. The best way to do this, and we actually have a resource that I think our colleague Rachel might share them with you in the chat. You can show the cards at the beginning of a session or at a time when people are calm. Make them easily accessible, and that way people will be able to use them when they need them. Next slide. And then finding ways to be an ally and make some of these kind of ways that you're trying to change your interactions clear. So finding ways of showing that you welcome movement. That can look like you not doing a typical like sitting still while you're talking to someone. Maybe you can stand up. Or you can let the other person know really clearly that movement, whatever movement is comfortable to them, is welcome in your space. You can model the use of sensory supports. You can pick up a sensory toy while you're having an interaction with someone. Kind of normalizing different ways of interacting can be really helpful. And then engaging in the other person's interests to build trust and rapport can be really powerful. I know a lot of times when we're in healthcare settings, we have to be moving really quickly, getting on to the next thing, or specific goals in mind. But even if you can spend a little bit of time to show that you're also engaged in who that person is, it can make a big difference. Next slide. When it comes to all of these things, I think what's most important is that if it's at all possible, trying to obtain individualized information from clients or patients or their supporters about their communication needs and strengths and preferences is going to be the most powerful thing. And so I just want to plug a really amazing tool from Aspire. If you go to the next slide. The Autism Healthcare Accommodations tool is freely available on the Aspire website. I think Rachel can put that website in the chat in a minute. But this is a survey that patients and their supporters can fill out. It provides information to their healthcare providers about their needs. So it asks them a number of questions about what helps them to understand things, how they prefer to communicate, things that make things difficult for them. And then it actually will then print out an accommodation report for that person can then share with providers, any provider that they interact with. And it includes information about how they understand things, how they like to speak, other ways they might communicate, and what might help them to understand and receive information better. So this is the website, autismandhealth.org, where you can find that healthcare accommodations tool and a lot of other really, really great information. All right, so next I'm going to talk a little bit about writing and talking to parents and other people, colleagues, autistic people themselves, about autism and autistic patients. You can go to the next slide, Kelly. Awesome. And next slide. Okay, Kelly already kind of touched on this, but the language that we use matters. You really are going to be wanting to avoid language that frames autism as something that somebody is suffering from or burdened by. You'd be surprised how often I still hear this from people. I've read it in papers that I've reviewed. You probably learned person with autism, and the idea behind person first language was that we shouldn't equate the person with their disability. But what we hear from so many autistic adults is that they feel their autism really can't be separated from who they are. It's a part of their identity, and it's not something to be ashamed of. And so that's why a lot of autistic adults really prefer this identity first language of autistic person. I think as a rule of thumb, if you're interacting with an individual person, ask them what they prefer in terms of language about autism. And then if you're talking about the community in general and you're unsure, most everybody agrees that on the autism spectrum is pretty innocent. Next slide. Another sort of language piece, or how we talk about things, has to do with this idea of the autism spectrum being this linear thing. And you probably know people, or you yourself are used to using terms like high functioning and low functioning. And these kinds of dichotomized terms can really flatten the experience of the autism spectrum, and ultimately are really not that useful. So I just want to give a little bit of an example. I'm going to describe two different people to you. So one person, both people have autism. One person is minimally or non-speaking. He lives with his family at home, and his family and he are really integrated in a vibrant community. He loves to go out and be a part of social events in the community. He's a really happy person. He needs a lot of support to get his daily needs met, but overall is able to really be a part of his family functioning and what they do in the community. The other person is verbally fluent, has a very, very high IQ, well above average, and is really crippled by anxiety and sensory sensitivities that make it difficult for him to interact in the community at all. Although he does live independently, he's unable to hold a job or have really any meaningful relationships for this reason. So which of these people is high functioning? And which of them is low functioning? I think that most the way that people typically use these words, they might call the former person low functioning and the latter person high functioning. And you can really see in the full descriptions how much that flattens the actual experiences that those people have. And so I would really encourage you when you're talking about people to try to be specific what you mean. If you find yourself wanting to call someone low functioning, you might want to instead specifically tell somebody why you're saying that. This person is minimally speaking, or this person has intellectual disability. This person has a lot of trouble with emotion dysregulation, or whatever the things are. Or you can talk about their strengths in that context as well. Next slide. All right. Relatedly, I think that, and this can apply to both reports or when you're talking to people, trying to change the way we speak to use neutral and strength-based language whenever possible. So this is really related to the idea that not all differences are deficits that need to be fixed. Trying to use more value-neutral language to discuss differences can make a really big difference. And so I'm actually going to ask for some audience participation here. If you want to pull out the chat, our little chat, I've got 3 common ways that people might describe autistic people. They might say, he's bad at communicating, or his eye contact is poor, or he has restricted interest. So I want you to try to think about, if you can just pick one of these and think about how to make the same piece of communication value neutral. So make it a neutral statement about someone, or even a strength-based statement. So I'm going to give people a minute to write, and then I'll let you know kind of like when to send the chat. All right, so folks can go ahead and send those if you have them in the chat. They have a very deep understanding of their interests. I like that a lot. Anyone else have some ideas? He did not use verbal language. That's great. Totally neutral. They prefer to communicate without eye contact. Awesome. Yeah, those are all great. Very similar to the ones I have. If Kelly, you want to uncover those? Yeah. So he communicates differently, which can make it difficult for others to understand him. I really like the example Emma gave because she was being specific about not using verbal language. He doesn't use eye contact to communicate, or things like they have a strong, deep interest in, they're passionate about, they're deeply interested and knowledgeable about. Next slide. All right, so another piece of this is acknowledging the role of society in challenges. So when we're discussing challenges, we can not place all the blame on the individual or on the autism, but also acknowledge that many challenges that autistic individuals and their families face are because of an unwelcoming and unaccommodating society. When we say things like children with autism struggle to make friends, or there are lots of intervention options for helping you or your child learn to socialize better. And I'm just going to talk about my examples here. So Kelly, you can click the next button. You might try saying something instead like, many people aren't very understanding or kind about people who are different. So children on the spectrum often need extra support to find friendships and communities where they can thrive. So here, we're not just saying children with autism are bad at making friends, but we're instead acknowledging that there's a role for society and why that is so hard. People on the spectrum tend to communicate and socialize differently, and that can be a challenge for them when interacting with people who don't understand. Your child will need more support in being understood by others. Next slide. I just want to take a minute to pause here to talk a little bit about autistic adults' call for accommodations and support rather than corrections. And we've sort of been touching along this the whole way, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that most autistic people are telling us they don't want interventions that focus on making them act like a neurotypical person, or interventions that are really focused on making neurotypical people more comfortable. Things like eliminating stimming and forcing eye contact can actually do more harm than good. So instead, autistic people really want interventions that are focused on improving their quality of life by increasing opportunities and access to self-determination, communication, self-advocacy, and independence, and that allow them to maintain respect and dignity. And then related to a lot of what we've been talking about today, acknowledging that it's not just the autistic person that needs to change or receive intervention for these goals to be met, that we need to also change as a society as well. Next slide. Something that you can do to help with that is to inform other people about the neurodiversity movement. So learn more about the neurodiversity movement by attending talks like this, or all of the talks that are happening this month. After you learn about it, introduce what you've learned to parents, to patients themselves, to colleagues of yours, and let them know about autistic adults as an important resource for learning about autism. I think one thing I tend to specialize in early childhood, and I think it's really rare when parents get that diagnosis for their child for the first time, for their clinician to tell them, oh, you know what's a really great resource? Learning about this from autistic people. They tend to be given resources like organizations that are run by neurotypical people to provide information about autism. So just to plug a few specific organizations, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network is an organization run by autistic adults. They have an amazing book for parents of autistic kids that I really like. And then the Thinking Person's Guide to Autism is a blog with lots of really interesting and thought-provoking articles written by autistic adults. Next slide. I'm getting to the end here. So we just wanted to do a little, our lab really, what we specialize in is emotion dysregulation and mental health. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about responding to distress, some of the things we've learned from our research and from autistic adults about what can be helpful and less helpful. And we have some resources that we can share on this as well. So in terms of supportive responses, thinking about when you're noticing distress starting or a meltdown or shutdown is starting, one of the most important things can be identifying a safe place to go. A sensory-friendly, safe room, like we talked about before, can be a hugely helpful thing where someone can be safe, where there are regulation tools available for them. They can reduce some of that cognitive overload by reducing sensory overload. And then for you yourself, just maintaining a warm, neutral, calm acceptance. I think we all know if we get worked up, then the person we're with is not going to it's not going to be as easy for them to come down from what's happening. In terms of what to do during a meltdown or during a moment of crisis, if it's safe, sitting quietly next to the person, trying to keep your verbal instructions minimal. So using those communication cards, or if you know the person well, and you can develop some established signs about taking a break. Instead of asking a bunch of questions, what do you need? What can I do for you? You could offer some kind directives, especially if you know the person well and you know some things about what's helpful to them. Let's go to the sensory room, things like that. If they need to complete a task in that moment, better probably not to complete any tasks, but if they do, then simplify any tasks that need to be done. And then if you know what's helpful to the person, and really only if you know, then offering to use calming strategies together. Let's take a walk together. You can just get out a fidget toy, offer them one, take one yourself, and start doing your own thing with them. So demonstrating that. After it's over, we really recommend that you proceed slowly. We know there are physiological arousal differences for many neurodivergent people, and it can take them longer to get to a point of being calm, sometimes even hours to return to baseline. And so really consider waiting to process what happened or apply specific consequences until much later when they're well regulated. This is going to make it much more productive. If you try to have those conversations too early, it's much less likely the person's going to be able to really process what's happening and be a part of that decision making. Next slide. And so in terms of some of the don'ts or how not to respond, a lot of these I already sort of talked about, but avoid asking lots of questions, lots of verbal input. like, what is wrong? How are you feeling? What's going on? You can make simple statements like, I see you are having strong emotions, but try to avoid a lot of those questions and a lot of verbal interaction. This always seems obvious when you're not in the moment, but it's really tempting to tell people to calm down or just relax. And I think we all know that never is helpful to anybody. Don't suggest breathing. This is also really common unless it's an established strategy. Breathing can be really helpful for people, but if it's not something that they know about or have practiced when they're calm, it doesn't tend to be very helpful in the moment and can feel invalidating. Don't apply punishments or rewards in the moment to force calming. And similarly, don't provide or threaten consequences in the moment. Like we talked about before, when people are dysregulated, it's really hard for them to process or understand those things. Wait until later when they're calm to be able to have those conversations. Don't demand eye contact, and definitely, as long as they're not hurting themselves or other people, don't discourage stimming. Lots of people say stimming can be really helpful for regulating a system. Try not to correct behavior unless you have to, and avoid physical contact unless you know for certain, because you know the person very, very well, that that's something that they would want. Next slide. This is my last slide. Probably the most important take home from all of this is to listen to autistic voices. All of the things that we shared with you today come from autistic people. So we're just sharing their voices with you. Any ways that you can find more ways to hear from and learn from autistic people, we highly recommend. Next slide. I think we have about 10 minutes or so to take some questions or have any kind of discussion that folks might want to have.
People are welcome to use the chat feature, the Q&A feature. I'll also unmute you if you want to use your own voice. Any questions or comments or feedback for discussion for Jessie or Kelly?
While people are thinking about their questions and comments, one fun thing I just thought of we didn't share is I'll put a website in the chat here because it will feel more celebratory. Is we have an area on our website for highlighting Autism Acceptance Month. It has really cool facts and videos. The videos are made by autistic people. All the topics we've talked about today with a ton of resources. And especially exciting is we have a new page on art and music highlighting neurodivergent and autistic people's art. And so it would be fun for, we have some musicians on here, some fun things to check out. Now it's unrelated to our talk, but still related. So. And also our website, as Jessie said, has all of these handouts and resources for you to pull from.
Well, thank you so much, Jessie and Kelly.
Thank you, everybody.
I enjoy this talk. Thanks for coming today.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, we
wait,
have a
well,
question.
Yep, we do. Go ahead.
That's it. Yeah.
So I'll read it aloud for everyone. With our society, we tend to self-diagnose and may run into people saying I'm autistic or joking about how everyone has a bit of autism. What would be a good way to lovingly correct and educate for those who are using these statements as a joke?
One of the first things that comes to mind for me always in these circumstances, especially when you're talking about someone who's maybe joking, is to ask them what they mean. I feel like that oftentimes gets at the heart of things for people. Honestly, even if they aren't joking, asking somebody, what does that mean to you? Or how does that show up for you? Might just allow you to get at the heart of what they're talking about, so that you can have a more meaningful conversation with them. in those circumstances, I think when people are joking, then they tend to realize their mistake.
That's a good tip. And I run into this comment a lot about the word neurodiversity, to be honest, too, and not just specific to autism, where we ran a huge school project about neurodiversity, and we worked with about almost 300 educators, and it quite frequently came up, like, isn't everyone a little neurodivergent? And so I want to second the tip that Jessie said. What do you mean by that? Because then someone can clarify. And then at times, sometimes I just say, well, actually, that's not true, for depending on what they're saying and the context of the conversation and things. In terms of self-diagnosis, I guess that's the only other thing that I would say is that I do think that there's a large group of autistic people out there that are not diagnosed, but like probably would meet criteria, and they're just the wait list to get diagnosed is very long. So I think that tool that Jessie said about what do you mean by that, I know yours is in the context of as a joke, but I do also know that many providers come to us with questions where lots of their clients come in saying I'm autistic, but they don't have a diagnosis on record. And so that is something to maybe explore with them and look into what their specific needs might be related to their autism, or what they feel like they would need some supports with in a healthcare setting.
Any other questions or feedback or remarks? Well, again, thank you, Kelly and Jessie. We'll have this recorded, and I will share the link with you guys, and you guys can get it set up, with Pitt. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye.